This video is brought to you by Blessed Be God Boutique, maker of Catholic fashionable apparel, handmade accessories, and more.
It's almost a cliche at this point when I tell you that the Synod on Synodality is part of a move by certain men who are allegedly holding office in the hierarchy of the church to institute a new religion. They use the rhetoric of a new religion. They call it the Synodal Church. They claim that the theology of Catholicism changed dramatically after Vatican II, to the point where the traditional Latin rite of liturgy that developed organically from apostolic times until about 1962 doesn't represent the theology of Catholicism anymore and isn't compatible with what emerged after Vatican II, the new theology. They consistently use this language of a new religion. This isn't really new. Some of us have been warning about this for some time, so I'm going to show you, before we get into the main story, something written by a priest 2 years ago, just before the synodal meetings kicked off, when the Synod of Synodality was still in its diocesan parish phase and in the continental phases 2 years ago. Yes, this synod has been going on longer now at this point than Vatican II went on. That should also be a red flag about the intentions of this synod. So we're going to go to an article from a blog called Gaudium et Spes, written by an anonymous priest, and he has to be anonymous, as you're going to see. The headline from this is Orwellian Synodality. Given the age of the article, my quote here will be brief compared to what will come afterwards. This article is again written by a priest who has to remain anonymous, who writes about his experience in seminary watching what he calls a new Gnosticism take hold in the church in the name of development and doctrine and the hermeneutic of continuity. Others have called it, what he's observing here, weaponized ambiguity, but it all amounts to the same thing. It all leads to the new religion taking hold in the church. Because one thing that virtually everybody agrees has been an issue in the church since Vatican II is ambiguity. Some people have said ambiguity is actually good. We've seen that as a development in the last few days. That some prelates say clear doctrinal language is actually a problem and should be avoided because it's too rigid. That ambiguity should be what the church strives for. To give you an idea as evidence for more new religion. So here's what that priest said in brief. Quote, "Therefore, what was true yesterday could be false today, since God's pedagogy and revelation is characterized by historical unfolding, whereby we move from infancy to adulthood with many missteps along the way. And those missteps could include errors in the Bible and church dogmas, errors which were the product of a more naive and pre-scientific adolescent stage of our development, and which we alone now have the vantage point from which to set them right. Because we are now in our own minds the adult phase of pedagogy. In other words, history as a rolling party bus of bar-hopping dynamical flux does eventually have a terminal point, and that point is us. And so the Theological Guild set up camp in Francis Fukuyama's cul-de-sac in order to engage in an endless block party of celebratory cultural exceptionalism. The flux stops here, and so does all real dialogue. There is a curve to history and has curved straight into modern liberalism's garage, and now the garage door is shut." End quote. He references Francis Fukuyama, who in the 90s, at the end of the Cold War, absurdly claimed publicly and was celebrated for claiming this, and people agreed with him, that we lived at the end of history, that we had essentially won, and that our way of life was going to be the dominant way of life, and that most major conflicts were over, and that we were now in the end of history. And that same kind of thinking is the core of the synodalists' thinking. It's also characteristic of even mainstream Catholic thought in the post-conciliar era. That's what he's saying. And that we are the enlightened ones who now understand where everything was, that we know better than the church fathers. How many times have I pointed out to you that Pastor Jimmy Martin of the Jesuit Church has been on the record as saying he believes that St. Paul got it wrong on that sin that James Martin has a rather unhealthy interest in? How many times has he said that he believes the Bible got it wrong? That's the thinking here. On that one issue is a perfect illustration of the broader problem. The anonymous priest goes on to describe how the belief now is that the church has essentially been wrong about virtually everything, according to those pushing synodality and the new religion, and that they fully admit it's a new religion because the old religion is wrong. We've seen plenty of examples of that in the language used by those pushing the synod. They refer to it as the synodal church, whatever that is, and how the old modes of worship in the liturgy aren't compatible with the synodal church that was born at Vatican II. They say that stuff, not radtrads. If you are an Eastern Rite Catholic watching them say this stuff, know that your divine liturgies aren't safe from them either. Their basis of their point for suppression of the traditional Mass is that the ecclesiology, the theology represented by that Mass, on how the church, what the church's identity is, what the church is, and its mission to the world is not compatible with the traditional Mass because it's too rigid, too clericalist, too exclusive, all the rest of it. That applies to your liturgies as well, whether it's the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom or the liturgy of St. Charbel or any of the other liturgies of what we generally call the Eastern rites. Your liturgy is not safe from them. No matter what Vatican II said about the preservation of your liturgies and traditions and cultural identities and the rest, it's not safe from them. That's what they are going to do to you. But all that brings us this development. A participant at the coming synod that starts in just a couple of days has admitted that they don't believe Jesus is God and believes the church has always been wrong about that since the beginning, to the point where this theologian is ready to propose a new creed for the church. Headline from the Spanish version of the Catholic News Agency. Synodal theologian says that, quote, Christianity should never have become a religion. Again, that's Catholic News Agency. That's not some random blogger telling you this. That's not some radtrad online. It's not Novus Ordo Watch or whatever other thing that gets maligned as being a fringe outlet. That's Catholic News Agency. It's kind of the Reuters of the Catholic world. This is a person invited to attend the synod on synodality. This person here is considered a scholar, though again, how intelligent can a Catholic be who denies that Christ is God and still receives the sacraments and still calls himself a Catholic? Sin darkens the intellect, and there can be no greater sign of a darkened intellect than to have rejected Christ and the magisterial authority of the church by rejecting the most basic authoritarian claim of the church, which is that the church was founded on the rock of Peter by Christ himself, because Christ is God. No greater sign of a darkened intellect than to claim all those things, and then to keep calling yourself a Catholic and to keep attending Mass and receiving the sacraments in a sacrilegious manner. It's just the most basic sign of a darkened intellect. But here is this theologian. Quote, Spanish theologian Cristina Hinoguez, who is participating in the Synod on Synodality by appointment of Pope Francis, because of course, argued in a recent article that, quote, Christianity should never have become a religion. In a text entitled From Synod to Jubilee, Building Community and Dialogue, Hinoguez argues that Jesus sought to transmit a way of life and human relations based on fraternity, not to found an institutionalized religion with hierarchies and, quote, to separate the small part from the rest, the priest, the clergy, although with influence, a lot of influence, over the rest. Quote, Jesus carried out his mission in everyday life, in the reality of everyday life, far from the temple, where he only came to engage in the only monumental anger he has in the entire gospel. An episode linked to the abuse of power, and which resulted in the expulsion of the merchants, she said. Hinoguez, who studied at the Faculty of Protestant Theology in Madrid, believes that the origins on the Synod of Synodality lie in the Aparecida Conference held in 2007, and in particular in the greeting given by Pope Francis after his elevation, in which, quote, there were no gestures of triumph. For Hinoguez, the Synod on Synodality, which will hold its second assembly in October, must be based on the idea that Jesus Christ did not leave us a pre-designed church structure but a way of life. In another part of the article, Hinoguez makes an interpretation of the gospel account of the celebration of Easter before the Passion, in which he relegates the sacrificial meaning of the Eucharist, where the author, quote, in the account of the Passover feast that Jesus celebrated with all those who accompanied him, although the Gospels only speak of the 12, and which we have turned into the Last Supper, we see that the core of the celebration is not centered on the body and blood. The most important thing is that the one who is going to give his flesh and blood lowers himself once again to show that his logic is that of service and not of power. In his dissertation, she also considers that the table is for everyone. The only one who could create rules and laws for someone to approach it is Jesus, the owner. And he didn't do it, and he doesn't do it, and he won't do it. And her argument in Ogiz also states that Jesus does not impose obligations like the Ten Commandments. Jesus presents a program in the Beatitudes. In a section dedicated to priests in the extensive 30-page article, Ogiz points out that, quote, all the baptized, even more so priests, are called to proclaim liberating news and not set rules and prohibitions. She also points out her view that the initial formation of seminarians and the ongoing formation of priests after their ordination is too focused on the fact that the priest must continue to configure himself to Christ the servant, Christ the shepherd, Christ the priest, and Christ the head. And she asks, where's Jesus the man? End quote. Little stumbling there on the she thing, but that's because the theologian's name is Christina, and there was a translation issue there with turning the she's into the other thing. So we had to fix that as we went. But that theology isn't a theology. It's a political philosophy turned into a theology. And that is the theology of Karl Marx. Because trust me, that political program is a religion itself. And this is liberation theology, just made nicer sounding. But it's the same thing. It's the hammer and sickle ideology presented as a form of Christianity. Now, the theologian goes on to describe how priests essentially separate man from God. Again, here's your rigidness, your clericalism junk. And it sounds pretty Protestant, doesn't it? I mean, it's a specifically Protestant claim that Jesus didn't establish a priesthood and that the priesthood was just an intermediary between God and man, that you can just go to God directly. But it's also a very specifically liberal Protestant take, for a lack of a better way of describing it. More than that, though, it sounds like a new religion where Jesus is just one prophet among many, right? You can easily take everything that theologian just said and bring in the wise men from other religions and have it still be completely coherent. But if this is a new religion, there should be at least one key evidence of a new religion, something like a creed or a position on creeds, right? Well, this theologian actually has a new creed ready to go to try to get the Synod on Synodality to accept it. Back to the Catholic News Agency article, not some fringe article, Catholic News Agency. Quote, as a corollary to her entire exposition, the theologian proposes a reformulation of the creed in the following terms. Help us, O Lord, to learn to be a church of people in a world of people, with people for people, with everyone without exception. May we be able to say in our confession of faith, I believe in a holy Catholic Apostolic Church for all, amen. End quote. It's a new religion. They have a new creed. This theologian even roots their errors in the Second Vatican Council, gives credit to that council for where we are today and for the basis of their own work, and even fears that we may be on the cusp of losing the Vatican II era in the Church. For once, I agree with the theologian and hope that a future pope does something about the errors born from that council and that we do finally leave the Vatican II era, and I do think that is coming. I don't know when, hopefully in my lifetime. But that is who Pope Francis personally invited to the Synod, because apparently synodality at its core is listening to everyone without judgment, even people who publicly deny Christ and say that Christ was not actually God, who believe that the church has always been wrong about that and that the priesthood is evil. Did you notice that little creed that she came up with? Sounds exactly like something Francis would say at some address somewhere. That is what they want to do. Now, I will again repeat what I've said before. The track record for these synods is that when they're finally done, they issue a document. And it's got some pretty radical sounding stuff in it. And Francis issues a document of his own that's more moderate sounding, but has some radical stuff in it too. But it makes him look better. That's the modus operandi here. Let me know what you think of this. Are you surprised? Does this surprise you in the slightest? Let me know what you think of this in the comments, please. So like and subscribe if you haven't. It certainly helps. So just sharing this on social media, that helps a lot too. And if you've ever thought about supporting the work of Return to Tradition, this is a great time to do so. It does help keep these daily messages coming. There are options to Patreon and the rest in the description box below. All those options asked for by viewers, by the way, as well as that join button right below this view screen. It does keep these daily messages coming and is greatly appreciated. And as always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.